Our next speaker is Lindsay Dubbs. Dr. Dubbs is the Associate Director of the North Carolina Renewable Ocean Energy Program at the Coastal Studies Institute and an Associate Research Professor with the Institute for the Environment at UNC Chapel Hill. Dubbs leads environmental assessment and permitting aspects of the NCROEP, where her research focuses on Gulf Stream ecology and ecological impact assessments associated with marine and renewable energy. She earned a PhD in environmental sciences and engineering from UNC Chapel Hill. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lindsay.
Thank you so much. I was trying to share my screen and I had a little, Jeesh. Okay. Excuse me. All right. So thank you all very much for your interest in the marine renewable energy sector and in our program specifically. My name, as Victoria said, is Lindsay Dubbs. I lead environmental impact assessment and permitting aspects of the North Carolina Renewable Ocean Energy Program. I noticed that there were a couple of environmental impact questions on the Padlet, so I'm really glad to see that some of you are considering the sensitivity of the marine environment as we think about putting more structures and having more human uses of that environment as we put marine energy into it. Our program is indeed considering the environmental impacts of marine renewable energy harvesting, and we are using a holistic and integrated approach, at least as much as we possibly can. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about some aspects of that work, but we are doing a lot of different things that I can't really cover in one presentation. And I hope that I address some of the questions from the Padlet during this presentation, but if not, we'll have time for questions. So we really aren't sure what types of devices we can expect to be installed in our offshore environment, but we know that there are many classes under development, including wave energy devices like an oscillating water column, a surge converter, or a point absorber shown here, or different scales of current energy devices. So this is a vertical axis tidal current turbine, and these are often arranged in arrays. And here is an example of an ocean current device. This is a barge with turbines underneath it, and this was developed by Magellanes Renewables. This is a 2 megawatt scale device. So regardless of what the development looks like, it will definitely introduce structures, moving components, mooring lines, and transmission cables, and it will increase vessel traffic in the area. And these introductions are going to alter the marine environment in many ways. Notice that not all of these impacts are negative. There can be habitat created, and things like changes in hydrodynamics can actually lead to upwelling of nutrients that can help support the blue economy like aquaculture. But some of the other changes will pose risks to elements of the marine environment. And the implications of those changes really depend on which organisms are in the vicinity of the development. So if an organism isn't present in this area, we don't have to worry about the impacts on it. And then also the scale of development is really important. So a sturgeon, for instance, that is navigating up into a river to reproduce can probably navigate around one tidal turbine pretty easily, but it might be a little bit more difficult for them to navigate through a whole array of them. It's also important to consider, and George kind of alluded to this as well, that we are not going to be deploying these devices into a pristine environment. There are already measurable changes occurring in the marine environment as a consequence of the current fossil fuel-based energy generating paradigm. And those changes are causing, those changes in temperature and pH are causing measurable ecological consequences. So changes in distribution and prey can have, of prey species like small fish, can have food web consequences all the way up to birds and predatory fish. And then there are things like changes are decreases in pH that have been shown to actually decrease the sensory capabilities of different groups of organisms like fish. So they aren't able to smell as well, they aren't able to use olfaction, and they aren't able to hear as well. Their ear bones don't develop. So I think it's important to consider that. And as we think about the organisms that we want to focus on considering for marine energy in North Carolina, those include protected organisms like marine mammals and sea turtles, highly migratory fish species, some of which are commercially and recreationally important, which has a cultural and economic importance to our state. And then sargassum, which is a brown macroalgae that is an essential fish habitat that accumulates along the western edge of the Gulf Stream that's very close to our coast. And the risks that I just mentioned, they pose concerns for different groups of organisms, and they're not ubiquitous across all of these different groups. So for instance, noise isn't really a concern for sea turtles, even though it's a concern for other marine, large marine organisms. And that's because sea turtles don't really perceive sound very well, as opposed to marine mammals or fish. They don't use it for communication or for navigation. So keeping all of that in mind is one of the things that we try and think about. And a lot of these concerns can also be mitigated by careful siting. So this is a map that we put together at the very beginning of the Renewable Ocean Energy Program, identifying some of the areas that are of importance for habitat for different groups of organisms. And if we know about the marine organisms and how they're using this environment and when they're using it, then we can try and find places that would be both feasible because they have a great energy resource, but also because there are few risks posed to the environment and existing human uses. And because a lot of our knowledge of our marine environment off the coast of North Carolina kind of ends at the continental shelf, a lot of our work to date has focused on the areas that are east of the continental shelf, kind of filling in some of the information that's being collected by the state and federal governments. And so one of the tools that we're using to understand how marine organisms are using that environment is passive acoustic monitoring, where a hydrophone like that, which is pictured here, is used to record sounds across a wide range of frequencies. And we use this acoustic or sound data to characterize the soundscape so that we can avoid areas that are really quiet and perhaps put installations that will be generating noise in places that are already noisy so that the natural noises will mask that noise from the energy generating devices. Right now, we're making recordings from the seabed underlying the Gulf Stream off the coast of Cape Hatteras for 5 minutes every half an hour. And we intend to begin taking similar measurements at the Jeanette's Pier Test Center, where the waves to water competition that George mentioned will occur. I'm going to play one of the sounds that was extracted from that huge data set here. And I think that Dana has a poll to correspond with this. So listen as I'm talking, in between when I'm talking, and see if you can identify which organisms you hear here. So these interesting sounds are luckily identified by computer algorithms because we have these massive data sets. As I said, 5 minutes every half an hour, and sometimes these hydrophones are left out for about a year. And if we were even to listen to some of these sounds, sometimes our ear would not pick some of them up. These vocalizations are actually being slowed down by fourfold right now. I'm going to start them again on my next slide. Oops. Oh yeah, so that was the poll question, sorry. So I'll start the vocalizations again. So we are learning a lot from this acoustic data. This figure on the right depicts the fraction of recording intervals per month from 2015 to 2016. That's on the x-axis. And on the top, we see the fraction of whistles. And these are instances where there are more than 3 seconds of whistling. And then this is the fraction of recordings where we have more than one quack that occurs. So you can see that we have marine mammals present year round. And if we were to add the low frequency vocalizations, the pattern's similar. We've also found that this is a very quiet location. Anthropogenic noise at our site exceeds the loudest natural noise, such as wave noise during windy time periods, less than 10% of the time. Okay, so now to get to the poll question and answer. If you said toothed whales, you were right. Whistles that you heard there and quacks that you also heard there are toothed whale vocalizations, and quacks have been attributed to dolphins and minke whales. We haven't really identified the species responsible for these vocalizations in our recordings, but we have observed bottlenose dolphins year round in this area, and other researchers have as well. So y'all did pretty well. Baleen whale vocalizations are lower frequency. There may have been some in there that were just hidden. So you may have been correct as well. Oops, I wanted to mention, and I'll give some links as well, I'll put them in the chat box, that there are really great tools out there for you to work with your students on sensory ecology and comparing sounds. There's a sound library and a really fun program available from Cornell. We also use satellite telemetry to understand the presence of sea turtles at this point in time in the Gulf Stream, and this might extend to other organisms. Thus far, we have tagged 5 juvenile loggerhead sea turtles collected during excavations from the North Carolina coast, and this is in collaboration with my colleague Larissa Avens at NOAA, as well as many others. And we tagged these turtles with solar tags, really small solar tags, after they reached the appropriate size, and released them in the Gulf Stream among sargassum in 2017. And what we learned from that is that these sea turtles stayed off of the continental shelf, away from that really high predator abundance area. They mostly stayed within the Gulf Stream current. And they, based on the environmental data that's stored in those tags, we also know that they stayed at the sea surface and associated with sargassum, which is another area of our interest for the Renewable Ocean Energy Program. So that's good news if we are looking at Gulf Stream turbines that would be far below the surface of the water. There would not be any risk posed to these small sea turtles. And there are also great resources for you to explore the movements of tagged marine organisms as well as terrestrial organisms, and I'll share some links for that at the end. Another one of our focuses is fine scale measurements and experiments during seasonal cruises. And these fine scale measurements are mostly centered around understanding these sargassum mats more. We collect data and samples on water quality characteristics, phytoplankton, and sargassum. And we do experiments back on the lab on the sargassum to understand rates of productivity and nutrient cycling. And you can see this sargassum is really great habitat for fish. It also is great habitat on all of these little surfaces. And here's some trichodesmium on the surface of that sargassum. Again, I have a lot of great collaborators that I'm really thankful for. And we've amassed a 21 seasonal cruise data set, which is about 5 years of data. And we have learned a lot from that as well. It has really, oops, I never shared these results. Sorry, I don't know how to do this.
I shared them, Lindsay. Could y'all not see them?
Oh, maybe they.
Yeah, about 58% of people guessed dolphins correctly.
Okay.
And 38% guessed whales.
Awesome. Okay, so from the sargassum experiments, we've kind of validated what was already known, that the sargassum is serving as habitat for lots of marine organisms. It's also fixing vast amounts of carbon. And some of that is available for these food webs, but it also is really important for carbon burial, because when this sargassum gets loaded with lots of growth on it, it sinks and takes carbon out of the biological reservoir and takes it to the deep ocean. The organisms that are on the surface of the sargassum, these epibionts, are also fixing nitrogen, taking it out of the atmosphere and making it biologically available in the water column for other organisms like phytoplankton to utilize and then pass up the food web as well. So sargassum is playing a lot of really important productivity roles. And as far as teaching resources, there are great long-term data sets available that for you to use in your classrooms. And there's also a way for you to ground truth satellite imagery data, which we are doing with these measurements. We're sharing it with NASA to help ground truth some of their satellite data. And so to wrap up, we are collecting this information, and it's turning out to be really important scientifically, but also it will help us to answer questions about how marine renewable energy might influence or be influenced by the environment in our region, and also will help with future permitting. And as I said, I'm going to put all of these resources into the chat box, but otherwise I am happy to answer questions. Oops.
So there are a few questions in the chat, and then one of them was actually with regards to careers for high school students. Is marine biology still a highly competitive field? Is it growing, or is it saturated with PhDs?
Okay, so marine biology, I was told back when I was getting out of high school, or sorry, out of undergraduate school, I was advised to avoid it as well because it was oversaturated. It is a very, everyone wants to study, you know, whales and dolphins, and that's what I wanted to study back then too. And in some really roundabout way, I ended up back out here, but I did my PhD work in a forest. I did my master's work in a river. So even if you have that interest and you can gain the skill set, I think that you can just take a wandering path anywhere. So maybe I'm not the best person to ask about that, because I think that if you just are optimistic and work hard, that you can make a lot of things happen. It is competitive, but it's also changing very quickly, as George said, so we need to understand it. It's very pressing.
Lindsay, would you let me comment too?
Yeah.
Well, I also started as a marine biology student at the University of Miami, and it was very competitive. And the big joke was that you could have fun waiting tables when you graduate. And I tend to be a bit of an idealist as a marine scientist, and I didn't really listen to that. And I agree with Lindsay in that, you know, if it's your passion, you should do what you love, and you'll end up getting somewhere doing something that you enjoy. It gives a very, very nice and broad and good foundation in science when you study that, because you get chemistry, physics, biology, geology, and it's a good stepping stone even if you change paths.
Great, thank you. So there are two questions about sargassum. The first one asks, is there sargassum in other concentrated areas in the world besides the western border of the Gulf Coast?
There is. So there's actually sargassum found in all of the world's oceans aside from the Arctic. But there is a mass accumulation in the Sargasso Sea, which is where it gets its name from. So that's where a lot of people might know sargassum. Well, it gets its name from a small grape that is native to Portugal, but that is how it was named by early explorers coming across the Atlantic Ocean and encountering it in the Sargasso Sea and thinking that they had reached land. I can answer the other one, like typing if you'd like, if you, no, okay.
We've got a minute. You can answer it live. That's fine. So sorry, that last question asked about plastic. Do you find a lot of plastic caught up in the sargassum?
We do. We find really large pieces of plastic caught up in the sargassum. And then we have worked with a couple of different groups collecting microplastic samples as well, but we haven't really processed any of those samples, or they haven't rather. So it is anywhere that there is an accumulation of material, you see just garbage in amongst it. So.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.